Picture this. You're 9 or 10 years old and it's summer vacation. Like most kids, you spend this time chilling and playing games. You don't own a console. What you do have is a computer, so you turn it on. And you spend hours bouncing between games like Happy Wheels, Habbo Hotel, Club Penguin, Gravity Guy, and whatever else you can find. Eventually, your siblings want to turn too, so you start sharing. You crowd around one screen, passing the mouse back and forth, playing games like Fireboy and Water Girl, Tank Trouble, or the legendary Super Smash Flash 2. If that sounds familiar, you probably grew up in the late 2000s or early 2010s, and experienced the peak era of browser games. Those games felt endless, easy to access, and cured our boredom. But then, almost without warning, they were gone. So, what happened? To know why browser games disappeared, we need to understand why they were so popular to begin with. But first, you have to recognize the internet they came from. Not today's internet, but the one from the early 2000s. You see, back then, gaming wasn't as accessible as it is now. Consoles were expensive and usually stayed in the living room. PCs were slow, shared, and often outdated. Gaming time was limited, controlled, and sometimes rare. Still, almost everyone had access to some computer, a family PC, a school computer lab, or an old desktop. And at the time, the web browser was the most powerful and accessible piece of software that most people had. For gaming, that meant you didn't need to download anything, install files, or ask for permission. If the browser worked, the game worked. And that mattered more than people realized, because internet speeds were slow and downloading games was risky. Viruses were common, parents were suspicious, and schools blocked almost everything except basic websites. Browser games slipped through those barriers by running directly on a web page. Flash made this possible by allowing interactive games to run on even weak machines. Low specs weren't a limitation, they were the target. If a computer could load a web page, it could run the game. This created a perfect setup. Players got instant access with no commitment, and developers faced almost no barriers to entry. You didn't need a publisher, a physical release, or marketing budget. You upload the game to a portal and let players decide if it was worth their time. That's why browser games felt so experimental and creative. They didn't need to appeal to everyone. It just needs to be interesting for someone not to close the tab. Browser games didn't rise because they were the most advanced games. They rose because they were the most available games. And at the time, availability was everything. Once browser games found their footing, things moved quickly. By the mid-2000s into the early 2010s, everything lined up. Internet access was widespread, technology was good enough, and no single platform determined how the games were supposed to work. You would open your browser and be met with endless options: racing games, puzzle games, platformers, and so much more. What made this era special wasn't just the variety, but how casual the experience was. You didn't make a plan to play browser games, you just ended up playing them, maybe for 5 minutes before dinner, between homework assignments, or until someone else needed a computer. And because you weren't paying for those games, you didn't need to justify your time. That freedom encouraged creativity that developers rarely have today. Instead of chasing retention charts or daily logons, they chased reactions, laughter, frustration, and those moments where things went hilariously wrong. This is why games like Happy Wheels worked. Not because they were polished, but because every attempt felt unpredictable and unique. And beyond solo play, many browsers were built for shared experiences. Games like Fireboy and Water Girl or Tank Trouble put 2 players on one keyboard sitting side by side, blaming each other when things went wrong. For many kids, this was their first multiplayer experience. There was no online matchmaking or voice chat, just someone next to you reacting in real time. Discovery felt organic too. There was no algorithm pushing games. You found them through friends, comments, or random clicks. Browser games didn't feel like products. They felt like small secrets people passed around. That's why this era stands out. These games didn't demand loyalty or daily engagement. They simply existed, ready whenever boredom struck. And for a brief moment, they weren't competing with anything else. They were the main event. The social element of browser games cannot be understated. When people look back, they usually remember the games themselves. But it can be easy to forget how social the experience really was. Not like online social, but real world social. Computers were shared, which meant playing a browser game was rarely a private activity. There were siblings behind you, friends shouting advice, and someone counting down the time you had left. Taking turns became part of the rhythm. You played around, laughed at the results, and then handed the mouse over to someone else. Some games fully leaned into the shared experience, forcing players to communicate and coordinate rather than play silently. Schools amplify this even further. Computer labs quietly became gaming hubs, and students would memorize which sites weren't blocked. One personal experience I had is that during lunch in 6th grade, we would run Super Smash Flash 2 tournaments, crowding around a single screen, taking turns, arguing over characters, and hyping each other up between matches. These tournaments became the highlight of the year, not because the game was perfect, but because everyone was involved. Before streaming existed, watching someone else play was the entertainment, and reacting together mattered just as much as winning. Browser games pull people together around one screen, and the social layer is one of the biggest reasons why they're remembered so fondly today. Not because of how they looked, but because of who you played them with. One of the most surprising things about browser games is how they were made. Many of the games that felt huge at the time weren't made by studios with large budgets or dozens of employees. They were often created by one person or a very small group of people, experimenting with an idea and seeing where it went. This was possible because Flash made game development feel approachable. You didn't need a complex engine or years of formal training. Developers could draw characters, animate them, add basic logic, and quickly turn an idea into something playable. ActionScript gave just enough control to make games feel responsive without overwhelming the creator. What mattered was that game creation felt possible. Making a game didn't feel like a distant dream that required permission or funding. It felt like something you could start tonight. That's why so many browser games had personality. The rough edges, strange mechanics, and unexpected humor weren't flaws, they were signs of innovation. Game distribution was also just as open. Developers would upload their games to portals like Newgrounds, Miniclips, Armor Games, and Congregate. These sites would act as the internet's arcade. Players would visit these sites just to try new games, so discovery happened naturally. If a game was fun, it spread. If it wasn't, it got buried. There was a simple business model that kept this ecosystem alive. Portals would sponsor games by adding branding to them, usually a logo and a link. The money wasn't massive, but was enough to justify making more games. For some developers, one successful browser game turned a hobby into a career. Because development cycles were short, ideas moved fast. Games were built in weeks or months, not years. There was no certification process or massive quality assurance team. You released the game, watched how people reacted, and adjusted or moved on. That speed encouraged creativity and risk in a way that's rare today. The browser game era felt alive because it was open. Open tools, open distribution, and open experimentation. It wasn't polished, but it was full of energy. The golden age of browser games didn't end suddenly. There was no single moment where people realized things were changing. Instead, it happened quietly as attention began to shift elsewhere. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, smartphones started becoming a bigger part of everyday life. At first, mobile games felt simple and harmless, but they had one big advantage over browser games. They were always with you. You didn't need to wait for a shared computer or search for a website. You tapped an icon and the game was there. That convenience pulled many casual players away, which was exactly the audience browser games depended on. At the time, discovery started moving off game portals and onto social platforms. Platforms like Facebook Games began popping off, not because they were better, but because they were impossible to ignore. Notifications had replaced word of mouth. Behind the scenes, browsers were changing too. Flash began to feel outdated as security concerns grew and mobile devices became more important. Flash also wasn't built for touchscreens and struggled to adapt to the direction the internet was heading. Developers noticed the shift early. Browser games felt riskier, monetization became harder, and the audience started fragmenting. Meanwhile, mobile platforms offered a clear path to monetization through paid apps and in-game purchases. Browser games were designed for short bursts of fun, but the industry was moving towards long-term engagement. The system didn't collapse yet, but the foundations were weakening. Up until this point, browser games were struggling but still alive. Then out of nowhere, Flash was officially shut down. Flash had been the backbone of browser games for more than a decade. It handled graphics, sounds, animation, and game input directly inside the browser. For most people, Flash was browser gaming, but it was built for an older internet. Security issues piled up, performance became a problem, and mobile support was almost non-existent. Browsers started limiting it, adding warnings and disabling it by default. Every extra click added friction, and the browser games depended on instant access. In 2017, Adobe announced that Flash would be discontinued, with support ending in 2020. When that deadline arrived, browser games didn't just stop updating Flash, they blocked it completely. Thousands of games stopped working overnight. Pages that once loaded instantly now showed blank screens or error messages. There were no fixes, no updates, and often no way to recover the files. Some developers managed to port their games, but most didn't. The audience had moved on, the money was gone, and rebuilding old projects no longer made sense. Flash wasn't perfect, but it made browser gaming possible, and when it disappeared, the era closed. Not with a dramatic ending, but with silence. That silence had created a question. If Flash was gone now, what was supposed to take its place in the browser? For a while, it looked like the answer was already here. In the background, HTML5 had been growing. You see, back when Flash was dominating browser games, a new standard called HTML5 was quietly being developed. HTML5 was designed to modernize the web by replacing plugins like Flash with native browser features, handling things like audio, video, graphics, and interactivity directly in the browser. Unlike Flash, which relied on a single runtime and toolset, HTML5 spread those responsibilities across multiple technologies like JavaScript and CSS. On paper, it was more open, more secure, and better suited for the future of the web. When Flash was shut down, many people assumed that browser games would simply transition to HTML5. The technology had existed and was more modern, but the shift wasn't smooth. The issues weren't just technical. Flash wasn't only a tool, it was an ecosystem. It combined animation, scripting, and interaction into one workflow that encouraged fast experimentation. HTML5 required more setup, more frameworks, and more testing across devices and browsers. That increased the barrier to entry. Many of those creators who thrived during the Flash era were filtered out by that added complexity. Distribution also changed. Flash games relied on centralized portals, and when those faded, HTML5 games didn't inherit a clear home. Monetization didn't improve either. Ads paid less than portals, and ad blockers became common. Mobile platforms, on the other hand, offered direct ways to make money. For most developers, rebuilding a Flash game for the browser didn't make much sense compared to releasing something for smartphones. HTML5 didn't fail as a technology. It simply couldn't recreate the condition that made browser games thrive. That moment had passed. So, what did replace Flash? Browser games weren't replaced by a single thing. Several systems moved in and filled the space left behind. Mobile games took over casual play by offering instant access and constant availability, but they changed how games were designed, focusing less on short bursts of fun and more on keeping players coming back through rewards and timers. Social platforms became the new discovery engines. Games spread through feeds and notifications instead of links. Visibility and engagement mattered more than experimentation. At the same time, live service games began dominating long-term retention. Instead of hopping through small experiences, players were encouraged to commit to one game through updates, seasons, and progression systems. As PC and consoles became cheaper and easier to use, browser games lost their original advantage. Easy access was no longer unique. The key here is that browser games were built around moments of boredom. Modern games are built around habits. When Flash died, it didn't just end an era, it pretty much erased it. Most browser games were never preserved. They lived on single websites, and when those sites shut down, the games disappeared entirely. Many developers lost their source files because no one expected the platforms to just vanish. When people went looking for their favorite games, they found broken links instead. That loss is what led to projects like Flashpoint, a community-driven effort dedicated to saving Flash and browser games before they disappeared forever. Volunteers archived thousands of titles, rebuilt broken dependencies, and created a way to run these games offline, long after original websites were gone. Communities tried to save what they could, but much of it was already lost by the time preservation became urgent. Browser games were like digital sandcastles, built for the moment and washed away when the technology supporting them disappeared, and with them went a piece of early internet culture. Browser games mattered because they changed what gaming could be. They removed gatekeepers and proved you didn't need permission to make something fun. They allowed ideas to be tested quickly and brought new people into gaming who otherwise might have been left out. They created shared memories. No platform wars, no hardware barriers, just links anyone could open. They showed games could be simple, weird, creative, and human. They didn't demand money or daily attention. They showed up, delivered a moment of fun, and let you move on. That kind of design still influences what we crave today. It's easy to look back at browser games as something small or temporary, but they weren't a downgrade. They were a response to the internet as it existed at the time. Open, curious, and experimental. They weren't trying to last forever or build empires. They filled a moment, shaped how a generation viewed gaming, and stepped aside when the world moved on. If you were there for it, you remembered where you were, who you were sitting next to, and who was waiting for their turn. You remember the laughter, the frustration, the feeling of closing one tab to open another when your teacher was walking by. Browser games may be gone, but they did exactly what they were meant to do. They give us something simple, chaotic, and unforgettable. And that's possibly the most browser game ending possible. Hey guys, thanks for watching all the way to the end. This video took a bit longer than I expected to make, but honestly, I had a lot of fun making it and had the opportunity to replay some of my favorite games when I was a kid. That's probably why it took so long though, because I spent way too much time playing Super Smash Flash. But you know, that's whatever. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a bit more about Flash games and what happened to them. And you know, let me actually know down in the comments below what your favorite Flash game was growing up as a kid. And you know, while you're down there, hit that like and subscribe button too. It goes a long way to helping out this channel. I also want to give a special shout out to HueyCoy. His video where he recreated a Flash game really helped me understand what made Flash so powerful back in the day. So go check out that video, link is in the description. Anyways, that's it from me, and stay good for your unk.